In this lecture, we are going to begin our exploration of the Roman Empire. Now, as you can see here, this is part one. We're going to look at the monarchy through the early empire. Much like I did in our chapter of ancient Greece, I decided to go ahead and break this into two separate lectures so as not to overwhelm you with masses of information. So this again will be the monarch through the early empire, the monarchy through the early empire, and then the second part will be the high and the late empire. All right, so to begin with, for the first time in history, a single government ruled an empire extending from the Strait of Gibraltar to the Nile, from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to the Rhine, Danube, and Thames and beyond. Romans presided over prosperous cities on 3 different continents, virtually ruling all of Europe, North Africa, and West Asia. The empire was made up of millions of people of numerous races, religions, languages, and cultures. Roman monuments and architecture are the most numerous and conspicuous of forms of antiquity. What we're also going to see is the diversity and complexity of Roman art foreshadows the art of the modern world. And Romans also used, we'll see this in this lecture and then more so in the following lecture, about how the Romans would use art to manipulate public opinion. Also, very importantly, the mastery of concrete construction revolutionized architecture. And Rome became known as what's known as the Caput Mundi, or the head or capital of the world. However, we have to remember when we were in the Archaic period, Rome was essentially an Etruscan city. And so we're going to briefly look at the timeline here. First, we're going to have the monarchy from 753 to 509 BCE. Honestly, we're not going to talk about this a whole lot. Basically, following its founding by Romulus, Rome was ruled by kings until there was a revolt against Tarquinius Superbus, and that was the last of the kings. Then we move into the Republic from 509 to 27 BCE, and this is after the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus until the bestowing of the title of Augustus on Octavian. Octavian was the grandnephew of Julius Caesar, and he defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and the Civil War ended in the Civil War that eventually ends the Republic. That will move us on to the early empire, 27 BCE to 96 CE, and this starts with the rule of Augustus. He reigned from 27 BCE to 14 CE, and this continues until the end of the Flavian dynasty. I'm sorry, my dog's playing. All right, sorry. My dog was playing in the background. Again, the rule of Augustus and continued to the end of the Flavian dynasty. Some notice emperors during this time, Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero. Then that moves us into the High Empire, 96 to 192 CE, and began with the rule of Nerva and ended with the last of the Antigone dynasty. Then that moves to the Late Empire, 193 to 337 CE, and began with the Several dynasty and included the so-called soldier emperors of the 3rd century and ends with Constantine, the first Christian emperor. And so I wanted to go over that timeline just so you can keep in mind as we're going through. For the main part, we're looking at the same geographic area in this chapter. Now, the empire may expand as we're going through it, but it's basically the same location. We're just traveling through time. So again, we're going to start with the Republic. Again, we had the monarchy 753 to 509 BCE, and this was ended with the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus. In 509, this is when the Romans overthrew the last of the Etruscan king and established a constitutional government, the Roman Republic. In this constitutional government, power was vested in the Senate, and the Senate was literally a council of elders and 2 elected consuls. Now, a dictator could be appointed for a limited time and for a specific purpose. So, example, commanding the army in a crisis. Originally, all the leaders came from the patrician class. These were wealthy landowners, but eventually those from the plebeian class held positions, and these would be smaller farmers, merchants, and freed slaves. Now we're first going to look at the architecture. In 211 BCE, Marsilius brought back to Rome the usual spoils of war, but also the artistic style of Greece. And this began the desire for, quote, all things Greek. And we kind of mentioned this a little bit when we looked at our ancient Greece chapter, because remember, a lot of the sculptures we examined weren't the original Greek sculptures, but were the Roman copies. And this was that time period where that was desire to have everything Greek. Greece actually became a Roman province in 146 BCE. And again, Romans developed an almost insatiable desire for all Greek antiques, as they would call them. And this is where artists of the Roman Republic drew on inspiration from both the Greeks and the Etruscans. And so what we're going to look at first is the Temple of Portunus, circa 775 BCE. And what we're going to see here in the architecture is mixing of forms is a primary characteristic of the Republican era Temple of Portunus. This was a temple to the Roman god of harbors, located on the east bank of the Tiber River in Rome. Now, the plan of this follows the Etruscan pattern with a high podium and a flight of steps only in the front. Only having freestanding columns. The only freestanding columns are in the deep porch, which you can see on the front here. However, the ratio is much closer to the Greek design for temples, the 1:2. Much of the stone is covered with stucco to try to also imitate the Greek marble. Now the columns are Ionic, which is also Greek, and there is an Ionic frieze. And so this resulting mixture of styles, the mixture of the Greek and the Etruscan, becomes distinctly Roman in style. Also, what's going to be very important in Rome is the invention of concrete. Now, concrete is a mixture of lime mortar, volcanic sand, water, and small stones. And so what you do is you mix this together, and then you pour it into wood frames, and there it was left to dry. Once it was dry, the wood frames were removed, and you have a solid form of great strength. Often the concrete itself is a very coarse material, and so the Romans would often cover the coarse concrete surfaces with stucco or marble facing. Almost think like a marble tile you would put on top of it. Concrete was much cheaper to use, and it was possible to fashion the concrete in forms in a way that could not be done in masonry construction. Most notably in the huge vaulted and domed rooms without internal support. Make sure you do read that sidebar on Roman concrete construction, especially paying attention to what barrel vaults, groin vaults, and hemispherical domes are. I promise you will see it again. Now, probably one of the greatest examples of early concrete construction is the Sanctuary of Fortuna, which was created in the late 2nd century BCE. It's considered the most impressive and innovative use of concrete during the Republic. It was a temple to the goddess of good fortune, and we can see it has several layered terraces and a heel. This is a inspiration of the Hellenistic East influence. But what this does is it uses barrel vaults to support the terraces, to cover the ramps leading to the grand central staircase, and also to give shape to the shops aligned on the 2 levels that sold food and souvenirs. And so here in the image you can see this is a reconstruction of what it is thought that the sanctuary looked like. And then I also give you an example of these barrel vaults that were used to create these this grand structure. All right, next we're going to move on to sculpture in the Republic. Now, patrons of the temples and sanctuaries were almost always men from old distinguished families. They were fiercely proud of their heritage, and that they were a different class from the plebeians and even the newly rich patricians. They kept the likenesses of their ancestors in wood covers in their homes, and they often paraded them around at funerals, meaning that they were proud of their long, rich family history. And so portraiture was a way that the patrician class could celebrate its elevated position in society. Now, what's interesting is the subject of these works were almost always older men. And the reason for that is generally only elders held power in the Republic. So they requested the images memorialize their distinctive features, meaning including their age. And these were called verist, or meaning super realistic works. And so on the left, we see an example of this. This is of an old Republican priest. We know it is a priest because the toga is draped over his head, and that tells us this, that while the priests were performing certain rites, they would put their toga kind of as a partial hood. So that tells us his position. But note, right, we can see the age here, the bald head, the lines, the bulges, and the folds on the face. And this is showing again his age, which is supposed to show that, he possibly held power as an elder. Now, some scholars have actually debated that these age marks may have been exaggerated to highlight the age in a way to making them appear even older, so maybe to make them show that they are even more respected. Now, what's interesting is the Romans believed that the head or the bust alone was enough to constitute a portrait. This was opposite of the Greeks, who believed the head and body were inseparable parts of the whole. And so the Roman copies of Greek works were often only of the head. And then what's also interesting is Republican sculptors would often place verist heads on bodies that they did not belong to. And so an example of this is the image on the right. This is a portrait of a Roman general circa 75 to 70 BCE, and it's marble 6 feet 2 inches. Now, what we see, if you look at the head and the face, it shows the Roman stern and lined face. However, look at the body. This is a powerful, youthful body. And this body itself was based on the statues of Greek athletes and heroes. So these two forms would not go together. This is not the body that goes with this head. But it was done to show that the general was older and wise, but still had the physically powerful body, emulating both things to be shown. Also, to be shown nude suggested that the person possessed a heroic character. Also beginning, we have them placing portraits of illustrious forebears on Roman coins. Now, an interesting example of this is the image on the left. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar places his own image on the coins with his title Dictator for Life. Now, placing the likeness of a living person on a coin violated all the norms of the Republican propriety. And so for this was just another example of how Julius Caesar basically offended the people in the Senate, and Caesar himself was actually assassinated shortly after that. In fact, the Ides of March 15th of the same year. Now, what's also interesting is former slaves could not possess any family portraits because under Roman law, their parents and grandparents were property, not people. So there was basically no lineage to celebrate. However, what would happen is freed slaves would often decorate tombs with figural reliefs to show their status as Roman citizens. And that's what you see on the right here. All right, moving on, we are going to look specifically at the city of Pompeii and the cities of Vesuvius. Now, Pompeii became a Roman colony in 80 BCE. In 79 CE, the long dormant volcano Mount Vesuvius suddenly erupted. For many people, there was no time to flee, and it covered the area in ash. And archaeologically, this was a great thing because it basically preserved the area. Unfortunately, many people were killed. It first was explored in the 18th century, over 1700 years after the eruption, and it has been called an archaeological time capsule because much of it was saved as it actually was at the eruption. In fact, this is often seen as the beginning of modern archaeology. In fact, if you go to Pompeii, it has been excavated and cleaned. You can still walk in the streets, into the areas with the baths, and even sit in the theater. Also, much of the artwork, the murals and mosaics, have been preserved. And what we're going to start looking at is looking at civic architecture. Now, the center of civic life in any Roman city is what's called the forum, or the public square. Usually this is in the geographic center of the city at the intersection of the Cardo, which is the main north-south street, and the Decumanus, which is the main east-west street. It's where they intersect. Often this was usually only open to pedestrian traffic, and it's where citizens conducted daily commerce and held festivals. Now, what we're seeing here is this is the Pompeii, the forum in Pompeii. Number one, right, is the actual forum on the image of the left. It has 2-story colonnades on 3 sides of a long and narrow plaza. At the north end is the Capitolumium, that's number 2, which is a temple honoring the 3 chief Roman gods, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. And this temple faces into the civic space dominating the square. It has 1 central entrance, a chief side, and again focusing attention to this main side. The area would also have statues of local dignitaries and even Roman emperors eventually. Surrounding the square are secular and religious buildings, and the most important is what was known as the Basilica, which here it's in the southwest corner, it's number 3. And this was Pompeii's law, court, and chief administrative building. Also in Pompeii, we have the amphitheater, which you see on the right. This was built in the southeastern end of the town, and it was constructed and paid for by 2 wealthy donors. It is the earliest permanent amphitheater known, and it could seat over 20,000 spectators. And what's interesting is seating was based on your civic and military rank, meaning the higher rank you were, the better seats you had. Now, amphitheater actually means double theater, and if you think back to the theaters we saw in ancient Greece, it does resemble 2 Greek theaters put together. However, these weren't created to put on the plays that we saw in ancient Greece. Here they staged bloody gladiatorial combats and wild animal hunts. Basically, this is also a man-made mountain with a shallow concrete barrel vaults forming a giant retaining wall holding up the earthen mound and stone seats. So to get, think of arenas, the stands, you have to have that sloping. So they would create this kind of mountain, and then the barrel vaults around it would be the retaining wall. We would keep the earth from, eventually sliding out. Now, what happens also is barrel vaults form tunnels that run through the mountain that lead to the arena where the action happened. Now, interesting, arena is the Latin word for sand, and the reason that was called this was because literally it would be on sand, because the sand was used to soak up the blood of the wounded and the killed. All right, next we're going to move on to domestic architecture. And again, the houses of Pompeii, the surrounding cities and villas in the countryside have the most complete record of the changing fashions and interior design decoration found anywhere in the ancient world. Again, because much of it was preserved because of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Now, what happens, though, is that we see that at this time, there was custom painted murals in almost every room. And they use what's called the true fresco or the buon fresco or the wet fresco technique. And this is where we've mentioned a little bit before, is where the artist literally is working the paint into the plaster. And so when the plaster dries, the artwork literally becomes part of the wall. Now, what happened though when early excavators found Pompeii, they would actually cut figural panels from the walls and then they moved them to the royal collection in Naples. Luckily, later archaeologists put an end to this practice. And 19th century German art historian August May, 1840 to 1909 are his dates, he actually created a classification system for the murals that were found. And he broke them into what he called 4 Pompeii styles. And what's interesting, these have been adjusted and tweaked a little bit, but they are still used as the basis for describing Roman frescoes today. So now we're going to examine the 4 Pompeii styles, and we're going to start, naturally, with the first style, which you see actually on the left here. Now, the aim was to imitate the costly panels that were using the costly marble panels in that. And what they did is they would use it doing painted stucco relief, and the idea was to use inexpensive manufactured materials to approximate the look and shape of more expensive materials such as marble. Now, this was not a uniquely Roman idea, and it never completely went out of style. I mean, think about it. We even do it some today. Think about, different types of flooring that we use. We use ones that look like a different substance when in fact it's a cheaper and easier to use substance. Now, the second style, it was from 80 BCE, it was the preferred manner until about 15 BCE. And most do believe this was a Roman invention. And now what they wanted to do in the second style was they were creating the illusion of an imaginary three-dimensional world. And you see this in the image here on the right. This is from the Villa of the Mysteries, circa 60 to 50 BCE. It is a fresco. It's pretty much the entire room, and it's 5 feet 4 inches high. And it's believed the room was used to celebrate privately the rites of the Greek god Dionysus, which is the Roman god Bacchus. There was, during this time period, a mystery religion that was popular among Italian women at the time that celebrated Dionysus. But what you see here, if you look at the figures on the wall, is they are nearly life-size, and it's a series of painted fresco panels. Now, there's the illusion of a shallow ledge where the human and divine actors move about, creating that three-dimensional depth. So it seems like, it's not just us going and putting our hand on the wall. It seems as if they're actually moving figures in 3 dimension. Also, you can see that it actually wraps around the room itself. If you look over on the right-hand side, there's a figure on the back wall on the right with a whip. However, she's actually whipping a woman on the connecting wall around the corner. Now, that was the early second style. We then move on to what's considered the mature second style, and this even more so extends the idea of three-dimensional design beyond the walls, usually showing some area that is outside the building. And you see here on the top, these are examples from the Villa of the Public, circa 50 to 49 BCE. And here you can see painted on the walls, it looks like as if the walls are actually opening up and showing us a world outside. In fact, we see vistas of towns, temples, and of courtyards. And then on the bottom right is what's known as the Prima Porta, circa 30 to 20 BCE, also fresco, 6 feet 7 inches tall. This was in the villa of Augustus's third wife, Flavian, and it's a barrel-vaulted room underground. And the reason you had this was because once you go subterranean, the temperature regulates, so this would be much cooler. But what's interesting is we see the walls are completely covered with a wraparound landscape scene. And the artist uses what's known as atmospheric perspective to create depth. And what atmospheric perspective is it's showing the world as we as humans experience it. So think if you look out your window. What's closest to you is going to be the biggest and in the most detail. And what's furthest away is going to be smaller, less detail, and also kind of like a hazy bluish gray tone. And that's what we see here. So again, it's supposed to give that illusion of three-dimensionality. Moving on to the third style. Now, the third style, we see a very radical change. And what happens is we see they begin to favor mural designs that reasserted the primacy of the wall surface. Instead of trying to extend past the wall, we're again focusing on the wall itself. They adorned walls with their delicate linear fantasies sketched on predominantly monochromatic backgrounds. And the image on the left here is an example of this. This is from the cubiculum in the villa of Agrippa Postumus, circa 10 BCE. Here in that center, there's a tiny little landscape that's painted directly on this black wall. There are no illusionistic elements. In fact, they're not even trying to tell us like this is some sort of fake wall, because if you can see the kind of columns there, we by no means think they're even supposed to be realistic. Now, some other third style walls had landscapes and mythological scenes that would appear to be in frames, but again, they weren't trying to fool us into thinking these were elaborate frames. It was just how they were. Now, the fourth style, which you see on the right, this became popular in the 50s CE. And this reintroduces illusionism, but it is different from the second style. Here we would views of buildings were considered irrational fantasies, meaning we'd see instead of this vast space that we would see in works such as these, right? We would actually see through these windows, it would be landscapes of different places that would not go together. Often these were crowded and complex and shows a blending of the styles. With this is the example we're looking at is from the Ixion room at the House of Vedi at Pompeii, circa 70 to 79 CE. Now, if you look, the lowest zone closest to the floor is an example of first style with imitation of costly marble. Then the large white panels in the corners show the third style influence. And then the fragmentary architectural we can see throughout the central and upper zones show the second style. But again, it's not exactly the second style because it's not showing us like one continuous landscape. It's showing us an ununified cityscape. So maybe one space is showing us something in Rome and next is showing a vast landscape. And so these again were not meant to be realistic. And so that fourth style, again, is a blending of styles. Now, also popular during this time were different wall mosaics. Again, mosaics were usually on the floor, but occasionally Roman mosaics were on the walls too. Sometimes they showed mythological themes, such as on the left. And then we're also going to see different paintings in the homes too, different murals. And again, they often showed a variety of themes. So subjects for these private homes were very diverse. You could have landscapes, scenes from history, painted portraits, sometimes portraits of famous men and women from earlier eras. And so that's what you see here. The top left is a mosaic. The bottom on the left, that is a portrait of two people within their own home. The middle on the right side, top right side, this is a portrait of Menander, who is a famous playwright. And then also during this time, still life paintings became very popular. Still life is the representation of inanimate objects artfully arranged, and that's what you see on the bottom right here. And what's very interesting is this work is very lifelike, and we actually do not see this skill level again until the 17th century Dutch still life painters. All right, now we're going to move to the early empire. So with the murder of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, this then led to a period of bloody civil war. In 31 BCE, Octavian, who was Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra of Egypt. In fact, they both ended up committing suicide. So Egypt, which was once the wealthiest and most powerful kingdom in the ancient world, became a province in the Roman Empire. In 27 BCE, the Senate confirmed the title of Augustus, meaning exalted one, on Octavian. Now, what's interesting is the empire was pretty much technically structured the same as the Republic. However, Augustus held all the key positions. He was also recognized as the princeps, meaning the first prince, was a consul, and imperator, which is the actual commander-in-chief, and it is the root word for the word emperor. After 12 BCE, he also had the title of Pontifex Maximus, meaning the chief priest. Now, these titles gave Augustus control of all aspects of Roman life. And then this also led to what's known as the Pax Romana. And the main thing Augustus is known for is he brought peace and prosperity to the Roman Empire. Known in his day, it was known as the Pax Augustus, meaning the Augustan peace, but it lasted for more than 2 centuries and it is now known as the Pax Romana, meaning the Roman peace. During this time period, the emperors commissioned a huge number of public works throughout the empire, including roads, bridges, theaters, amphitheaters, and bathing complexes. Also, we're going to see imperial portraiture statues and monuments celebrating the rulers' great deeds, and that the rulers, reminding the citizens that the rulers were the reason for the peace, meaning these are used as pieces and works of propaganda. Many of them were not historically factual and were designed as propaganda to mold the public opinion about the emperors. So we'll start with Augustus Caesar and the Julio-Claudians. Augustus was actually not yet 32 when he became the leader. After his death, Julius Caesar was declared a god, and Augustus never claimed himself to be a god, but he would claim he was the son of a god. Now, portraits of him were designed to show him as a godlike leader who never aged. Even near his death in 14 CE, when he was, I believe, 76 years old, official portraits still show him as a handsome youth. Emperors and empresses at this time were often shown in many different roles, including as gods. So do make sure you read the sidebar, role-playing in Roman portraiture. Now, what happens in works featuring Augustus were often models after Greek statues, and we see that in the work here on the left. This one is commonly known as Augustus as General, circa 20 BCE. The original was bronze, however, this is a marble copy, and you can see the influence from earlier works. It's standing like Polykleitos Doriforibus. He has his hand, though, raised like an orator, but here he's addressing the troops. If you look, his head is of a younger man. You can see it in the shape, the sharp ridges, and his full hair. The clothing and items with him carry a political message of diplomatic victory. And look down by his feet. You actually see Cupid there. And this is proclaiming his divine descent, meaning he's from the gods. Caesar's family, the Julians, trace their ancestry back to Venus. Venus was Cupid's mother. Also, this is shown that this showing them as younger and youthful was not just in men, but it was in women. Here we see a sculpture of Livia, early 1st century CE, marble, 1 feet, 1.5 inches. And here, this again was the third wife of Augustus. And here you can see she's also sharing this eternal youth. Here she has her hair in the style of the time, but she's shown with blemish-free skin and sharply defined features, meaning a young woman. Now, she actually outlived Augustus by 15 years, dying when she was 87. And her different portraits would show her in the hairstyle of the times, but her face did not change. And again, this was showing her exalted position in the Roman state. Now, next we're going to look at a monument to Augustus. And this is what's known as the Ara Pacis Augustine, created 13 to 9 BCE. It is the altar of Augustan peace. In 9 BCE, the Senate dedicated this monument celebrating the emperor's most significant achievement. the establishment of peace. Now it is decorated with figural reliefs and anchithesis tendrils. You can see that in the top image. Now, the panels on the east and west sides depict selected mythological subjects, including Aeneas making a sacrifice. Now, Aeneas is the legendary founder of Rome, or where Rome would be, and this was shown in Virgil's text, the Aeneid. Now, what's important and why Aeneas was shown, Aeneas actually has relations to ancient Greece, right? Aeneas was a Trojan. He was from Troy. And after the fall of Troy, he and the survivors of Troy basically traveled to find a new homeland. And the legend was that they would know where they were supposed to be when they were so hungry they would eat their plates. And so the Aeneid follows their different travels around until finally they're in an area and the people there are feeding them. And then what they do is you're given a hard piece of bread, and then they put the rest of the food on top of the bread. And then as you're eating, the food soaks into the bread, and at the end, it's soft enough that you can eat it. And so what happens is that's when Aeneas and them realize that they just ate their plates, and so they are where they are supposed to be. This supposedly is where Rome was founded. Now, what's also important with Aeneas, right, this connection from the Greek world to the Roman world, Aeneas is also a mortal son of Venus. So again, this is showing one of Augustine's forefathers. Now, another shows on the bottom left here, I should put this one on here. It shows a seated matron. We're not really sure who this is, but she's holding two healthy, lively babies on her lap. And she's surrounded by all the fruits that the peace has brought, saying, without this peace, there would not be this celebration, this ease of life. Now, the panels on the north and south show processions of the imperial family and important dignitaries. This obviously was inspired by the Ionic frieze at the Parthenon. And here's an image of this on the bottom right. This makes a political as well as an artistic statement. In fact, you can actually find some recognizable historical figures within this. But what's more interesting is that we actually have the inclusion of children. And the children are acting like children would, right? If you see, they're kind of talking and interacting with each other. Now, this was never seen before on Greek or Roman statuary monuments, state monuments. And it gives it, as it says in your text, a much more natural feeling, right? That children are often not, shown in the dignified and quietness such as adults are. However, it is believed this was probably this was actually showing Augustus's desire to boost the declining birth rate among the Romans, especially the Roman nobility. And so the figures here shown, these are men with their families, and they're being shown doing their duty. All right, next we're going to talk about the Forum of Augustus. It's not pictured because it is just in ruins today. However, it was the most ambitious project he had, and it's made mostly of white marble. Now remember, marble was usually hard to get. However, it was readily available under Augustus because of the large area he had claimed. And so what this is, Augustus himself actually made the claim that he found Rome a city of brick and transformed it into a city of marble. Also within the Forum of Augustus, you're going to see many Greek influences, especially to Athens. Again, showing that connection to the Greeks. And then next we're going to look at the Pont du Gard, which is circa 16 BCE. And this is an aqueduct bridge over the Gard River, and it's in southern France. Now, this was part of a large aqueduct system. And what the aqueducts would do is they would bring water to certain towns, to these large cities from water sources further away. Again, the emperors would build these to, supply their people with their needs, but also to show their greatness. And so the Pultagod aqueduct, the bridge here, this is actually bringing water to Nimes from a mountain resource. And it provided about 100 gallons of water a day for each inhabitant of the city. And the aqueduct itself carried the water over 30 miles. So it had to be designed very specifically because the water moved by gravity. And so what we're going to see in this design is that it's a continuous, gradual decline. That way the water would travel by itself all the way over the 30 miles to the city. All right, and then we're going to move on to our last section for today, and this is looking at the Flavians. In 68 CE, Emperor Nero committed suicide to avoid assassination due to his poor behavior. You can read in your textbook where they talk about the Golden House or Golden Palace of Nero. He was not well liked, and he was often very selfish and looked more after himself and his own wants and desires and not those of the people. So what happens is he commits suicide to avoid assassination, and this started a year of bloody conflict. Eventually what happens is as Vespasian, who ruled from 69 to 79 CE, emerged triumphant, and he had been a military leader under several emperors. After his death, his two sons also served as emperors, Titus from 79 to 81, and then Domitian from 91 to 96. The family name was Flavius, and so that's why these are often known as a Flavian dynasty, and they ruled for more than 25 years. Now, probably one of the greatest things during and what they're probably most known for is the Colosseum was constructed during their rule. Now, it was known as the Flavian Amphitheater after the family. It got the name Colosseum, and that comes from its location that was next to the Colossus of Nero. So Colosseum was just kind of the name it became known as. It was the Flavian Amphitheater. Now, it's very interesting. The site it was constructed on was done very, very politically. And the site was actually over the artificial lake of Nero's Domus Aurea. They drained the lake, and then they constructed the Colosseum on it. Now, this was a political move because Vespasian reclaimed the public land that Nero had confiscated for his own private use. And Vespasian literally gives it back to the people. This was the largest arena ever constructed, and it could hold over 50,000 people. It was finished in the year 80 CE under the rule of Titus. Now, it could not have been built without concrete. It's made of a complex system of barrel-vaulted corridors held up. These barrel-vaulted corridors held up the enormous oval seating. And you can see from the view on the right as we're looking down at the Colosseum, much of the marble seats have actually been removed, but you can see these different rows of seats. And so the barrel vaults that you see on the left hold these up. Excuse me. There was also a complex system of barrel vaults that were used as tunnels, and there were actually several substructures within this, meaning they were below the actual amphitheater floor, and these can be waiting rooms for the gladiators, animal cages, and props and settings that could be raised or lowered. The Colosseum is 160 feet high, or what's equivalent to 16 stories today. And there were actually 76 numbered gateways for people to enter and exit. Think about that. If you've ever been to, a sporting event today, you go into specific gates, you go to your gate. That's exactly what these were. And what happens is there are also, the spectators here also sat according to their place in the social hierarchy. Again, meaning the higher you were considered in society, the better seats you would have. Now, the facade that you see on the left here, this is done in 4 bands, and each is in a specific Greek order. First, we have the Etruscan, then the Ionic, and then ending with Corinthian. And so you could see again, this work is a combination of the different styles, which was shown as typically Roman. All right, now portraiture during this time period is very interesting because again, we're gonna see it change from when it was Augustus. Augustus, remember, showing them as young and beautiful. Well, what happened here is Vespasian again was trying to separate himself from Nero. And so he wanted to show he was very different from the self-indulgent Nero. So what happens is he resuscitated the Verus tradition of the Republic. And you can see that in the work on the left here. And it's showing him with receding hairline and aging leathery skin. And again, this is not to show necessarily that he was older like they wanted to in the early Republic, but again to show that he has traditional Republican ideas and values as compared to Nero. And then finally, we're going to look at the Arch of Titus, which is seen here on the right. This was created after 81 CE, and Titus, the oldest son of Vespasian, died in 81 CE after only reigning for 2 years. His younger brother Domitian becomes emperor, and he erected an arch in Titus's honor. Now this was on what was called the Sacred Way, which led into the Roman Forum. Now triumphant arches began to show up in the 2nd century BCE. And they did not only celebrate military victories, but also other good deeds by the emperor. This is example of what's considered an early typical triumphant arch, meaning it has the one opening. Usually there are gilded bronze figures, statues that sit on top. We see the engaged columns, again meaning they're part of the background, that form the opening. However, these are what are known as Roman composite capitals. And what these are is they're actually combination of the Ionic volutes and the Corinthian echeneathias leaves. Also, we see the personification of winged victories are in these spandrels. That's the area between the arch's curve and the framing column and the frieze. And so in that, there's the winged victories. And then the dedication in the attic or the top reads, "The Senate erected the arch to honor the god Titus, son of the god of Vespasian." Meaning the Senate, what usually happens, this was not unusual, and usually what happens is the Senate, after an emperor would die, as long as he was well-liked. If he wasn't well-liked, this would not happen. But after an emperor would die, they would declare the emperor gone. So when Vespasian died, he was declared a god. When Titus died, he was declared a god. So this is saying, right, basically that they've both died and are now gods. Now, what's interesting is there are 2 different high relief friezes inside the arch. And one shows Titus's victory at the end of the Jewish War in 70 CE. Note in your textbook, the image of it, you can see a very large menorah shown. And so this is showing an event that actually happened. However, the other frieze in high relief shows him in a triumphal chariot, and this is more of an allegory. In fact, Victory, the winged personification, rides with him and places a wreath on his head. Also, the personification of honor, onus, and valor, virtuous, are also shown within the work. Now, what's interesting is this is the first known intermingling of divine beings interacting with humans on an official Roman historical relief. Now remember though, this is not honoring Titus as the individual. This is to him as he's already a god. So this is after his death, showing him, it seems like instead of human with gods, it's God with God. However, again, the first time we do see this interaction in between humans and divine beings. And what we're going to see, though, is that in the following periods, this interaction between mortals and immortals is going to become a staple of Roman narrative sculpture. And we're going to see this actually changes to the point where it's not even done after their death. We will see this intertwining and interactions of mortals and immortals during the emperor's life, why they were still alive. So we will pick up with that in our next lecture.